2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
Meanwhile. 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night. Later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later. 1 winner later. The following day. Meanwhile. Later. Just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Later, in the void. Approximately 10 hours later. Early the next morning. 1 shift later. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 1 long angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence. The next morning. Montage. The next morning. Many tic-tacs later. Flashback. End of flashback. The very next evening. 1 hour later. The next day. Later. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... the next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. Several days later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
6 months later!
Meanwhile,
5,000 celebrities later.
1 little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later, 1 hour later, 5 million years later.
The next morning. Later that night. The next evening. 1 operation later. 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning. Later. 1 hour later. 7 months later. The next Christmas. Several long days later. Many toys later. 12 sleepless hours later. The next morning. Many frame building attempts later. Even more boat building attempts later. 1 day later. 1 humongous meal later. A little while later. Later that night. 1 entree later. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Several bouquets later. 10 hours later. 80 minutes later. Many memories later. 1 week later. Happy friendiversary.
Later.
Later. Many unbearable moments later. The next morning. Many adorable hours later. Several days later. Much later. 1 week later. 1 beautiful Christmas morning later. Many versions later. 1 week later. Many meeps later. Many plays later. Many superstitions later. 2,000-ish years later.
Many buckets later!
14 hours later. Days later. Meanwhile, many repressed memories later. The next morning. 1 nap later. 24 sleepless hours later. Several days later. 1 journey through space later. Much tranquility later. Many invitations later. 6 to 8 weeks later. 2 weeks later. 1 hour later. Many hours later. A few moments later. 800 kajillion potatoes later. Several hard-hitting hours later. The next day.
1 minute and 7 seconds earlier!
1 a while later. Many miles later. The next day. 1 week later. 1 bus ride later. The next morning. Many exam questions later. The next morning. Many hours later. 2 minutes later. Several hours later. Several thousand ripped pants later. 1 hour later. Several months later. 200 whoopsies later. 6 stinky months later. Several weeks later. Later that night. Abracalater. Abracalater. Not much later. Nine hours later. Many hours of fun time later. 1 minute later.
Several unproductive hours later.
1 month later, 4 hours later, several corruptions later.
Later that day. A few moments later. 1 second later. Many chilly hours later. 2 seconds later. The next day. 2026 years later. 1 full day of fatherly fun later. 3 seconds later. 1 smelly week later. A few seconds later. 1 week later. The next morning, like every morning. Stupid early the next morning. The very next day. A few seconds later. Many seconds later.
1 to 2 minutes later.
The next morning. 1 minute later. The next morning. 1 minute later. 2 minutes later. 3 minutes later. A few minutes later. The next morning. 1 week later. Meanwhile, deep in the kelp forest. Many minutes later. 237 hours later. Many hours later.